Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to sqadia.com. My name is Mohammed Osama, and we are talking about research designs in medical statistics and research. And this specific lecture is about analytical studies or analytical research. So, we are going to talk about different types of analytical studies, including cross-sectional comparative studies, case control studies, and cohort studies. So, starting off with what are analytical studies. So, analytical studies are actually a sub-branch of observational studies. Observational studies consists of analytical studies and descriptive studies. So, analytical studies is one of them, and these studies identify and quantify associations, test hypotheses, and identify causes. So there is a lot of quantitative results which are given in these type of studies, and you can also use these type of studies to test different type of hypotheses. For example, a hypothesis: is there a positive correlation between increased physical activity and decreased weight? So if you want to test this hypothesis, you can use analytical studies. They also determine whether an association exists between variables, such as between exposure and disease. For these type of questions, we use cohort or case control studies. So as we already discussed, observation studies are of two types: descriptive and analytical. In analytical, we have cross-sectional comparative, case control, and cohort studies. So let's start off with cross-sectional comparative studies. So we've already discussed cross-sectional surveys. So it is essentially a cross-sectional survey, but it is actually the difference in the way you are analyzing the data that it makes it a cross-sectional comparative study. For example, you want to find out that in the class there are males and there are females, and you want to find out that which of the two categories, the male or female, are more active. So you are comparing the activity status of both the groups, the gender, at one point in time. So this is known as a cross-sectional comparative study. So it is the same in terms of conducting it, just like a cross-sectional survey, which is a descriptive type of study design. But the way you're analyzing the data, it makes it a cross-sectional comparative study because you're comparing two or more than two groups. So this is a cross-sectional comparative study. Now, case control studies, as the name suggests, that there are cases, somebody who has, or individuals who have a certain type of condition or disease, and control who do not have that. So this study investigates causes of diseases or factors associated with a condition, also known as risk factors for that condition. For example, so I say smoking is a risk factor for lung cancer. So this type of study can be used to find out if that is the case, if you want to test such an hypothesis. It starts with the disease or condition of interest, which are labeled as cases, and a comparison group without the disease, which are labeled as controls. So cases and controls are compared to identify possible causal factors. Now, this type of study is usually retrospective, which means when you start the study, so there is a group of patients who already have that condition or disease, they already have developed it, and there's a group who do not have that specific disease. So you go back in time and take the history from those patients or participants and try to identify if that group had that specific type of risk factor or not. For example, let's suppose there is this group of patients who have lung cancer. So these are cases, and we have control who do not have lung cancer, and we take histories and we try to find out that how many of the individuals used to smoke in among the cancer patients, and how many of individuals used to smoke among non-cancer patients. And you also try to find out the frequency of smoking, and then you try to compare their histories and draw conclusions out of it, that if there is a causative relationship between the risk factor and the disease, the risk factor which is the smoking. So When to use a case control design? So to investigate risk factors for a rare disease where a prospective study design would take too long to identify sufficient cases, because prospective study design or a prospective cohort study takes a long time, because you need to wait for the patients or the participants to develop that condition or symptom or disease. On the other hand, another use of case control design is to investigate an acute outbreak in order to identify causal factors quickly, because you do not have the time to carry out a prospective study. So you have to find out the causal factors or risk factors as soon as possible, so you can use a case control design for that. Another thing that you can ideally take the same number of cases and controls in the case control design, but there is a popular belief that you have to take one case for every three controls, and that is actually not the case, because if you take too many controls and too less of cases, that also affects the validity and generalizability of the results. So you can take 1:1 as well, but you can also take 1:3, which is actually a popular belief among researchers. Now, what are the advantages and disadvantages of a retrospective case control study? So, risk factors are collected after the disease has been identified based on the histories given by the participants. So, the advantage of this is that exposure has already happened. So, data collection is easy and you don't have to wait for the follow up. You just take the history from the patient and or the participant, and you can just pen it down and enter in your data, and you can find out the results. But the disadvantage relates to the quality of the data. If it's of poor quality, so then the study would be of poor quality as well. How? It is because that data taken from clinical notes may contain errors, or it may contain missing values, or it may contain for example, if you are trying to look for some specific variable or some specific question, but there is no mention of it in the case history of that patient or the group of patients that you are looking for. So you cannot rectify it, or you cannot fill in the gap. So that is the major limitation of this type of study. But if it was a prospective study, you can ask all the questions that you wanted from the patient. And the second is that if the data is obtained directly from the subjects in terms of their history, so there's also a problem. You can ask all the questions, so there you may not need to fill in the gaps, but there still is a problem of recall bias. So the patient or the participant may not exactly remember what happened, or the patient or the participant may even exaggerate something. So there is actually a chance of recall bias as well. Now, cohort studies. So cohort studies are actually slightly higher in the, you can say, category when it comes to the hierarchy of research. So they are at a higher level than the case controls. And their aim is to investigate causes of disease or risk factors for diseases, but they are more valid and absolute. These studies are mostly longitudinal and prospective, and they start with an unselected group of individuals who are followed up for a set period of time. So when you select those patients, so they do not have that disease or condition. So if we take the same example as for the case control, so there are individuals, none of them have the disease, but some of them are smokers and some of them are non-smokers. So it is a prospective study. So you follow those patients for a specific period of time, and you try to see that how many of these smokers developed lung cancer and how many of non-smokers developed lung cancer, and then you can exactly identify the risk factor or the causal factor for that disease or condition. So that is the importance of cohort studies. So cohort studies are sometimes used to confirm the findings of a case control studies as well. If case control studies, for example, it showed that like for example, smoking can be a risk factor for cancer, or smoking is a risk factor for cancer. So to confirm that finding, you can carry out a cohort study based on that case control study. Case cohort studies can also be retrospective, but it requires full risk factor data obtained for all individuals with and without the disease of interest. So if you have missing data, so then you would not be able to do it retrospective. But once again, prospective cohort is always superior than retrospective study design. So what are the difficulties with cohort studies? A large sample is needed to obtain enough individuals because not everyone is going to develop a specific disease or condition. The length of follow-up may be substantial to get enough disease individuals, and so the cohort is not feasible for rare diseases because it would take a long time. And the difficulty in maintaining contact with the subjects because it is a very long study, so it is very difficult to keep the follow-up, and very high resources are required. But another benefit of course studies is that, just as we discussed, that we can use cross-sectional surveys to find out the prevalence of any condition. We can use cohort studies to find out the incidence of any condition or disease. So that is an important point associated with cohort studies as well. So when to use a cohort study design, as I already told you, you can use it to find out the incidence of any condition or disease. You can also use it when precise estimates of risk associated with particular factors are required, because it is more precise in terms of identifying risk factors and causative factors as compared to case control studies. So usually used when case control study has established an association, but you want to find out if it is precise, and you want to reinforce those findings, so you can conduct a cohort study, because case control study is not able to provide estimates of risk. So when information on past risk factors in individuals with disease is unavailable or too unreliable, so you cannot conduct a retrospective study, so you can conduct a prospective cohort study design for it. And when the time course of a risk factor is of interest, you want to find out that in how much time, this risk factor actually results in the development of a specific condition or disease. So then you can use these type of study design as well. And when resources and time are sufficient to support a lengthy study, so then why not go for a cohort study, because it is higher in terms of hierarchy of evidence as compared to case control. So that was all about the analytical study designs, and I hope you learned something out of it. Thank you very much for watching sqadia.com.